And yeah, so let's begin. So hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of Techquitable. This week we'll be going over the topics of the interview process, resume, and behavior rounds. And we hope that understanding these non-technical things could really kind of put perspectives on what the interview would look like and put you up on a rail for success here. So let's get started. So yeah, this is a topic that we'll be covering. So let's talk about interview types. So just to kind of get a big picture understanding of like, okay, what are even the different types of questions that I could get even asked during interviews? So this is it. We think that there are 6 major types. The first is algorithm questions. The second is behavior questions. Third is program design. Fourth is take-home project. 5 is system design, and 6 is trivia questions. And we'll now dive into a little bit of details of each of these kind. So what are algorithm questions? Well, algorithm questions ask you to solve a problem through coding and require you to use your knowledge of algorithms and data structure. So one example could be that, hey, given a string of S, return true if it is a palindrome, or false otherwise. And the other example could be that, hey, if you're given an integer array of coins representing coins of different denomination and an integer amount representing a total amount of money, return the fewest numbers coin that you need to make up that amount. And if that amount cannot be made up by any combination, just return -1. So it's very kind of like algorithmic, and you need to use either like some algorithms or data structure to like solve this problem. And the tips that we had is that, we'll be going over this in details, but there's this thing called 5-step approach to answering these technical questions that you can follow and respond in like a more structured way. And of course, our kind of recommendation is to learn the fundamental and patterns using resources such as Cracking the Coding Interview, which is like a great book, LeetCode, which is an online website. They could code these, you could practice. And there are also other online courses out there, such as Grokking the Coding Interview. And then the key is to just practice. Everybody who has kind of like who goes through the interview process just puts in a lot of practice to be able to pass these interviews. So yeah, that will be our recommendations.
Pero lo que pasa es que Jasmine un poquito odiosa, no nunca está disponible.
Hey Dario, I'm going to have to meet you because your sound. Oh, thanks. All right, moving on to behavior questions. So behavior questions ask you to highlight your personality, habits, and thought process based on your past experiences or self-reflection. So some example questions that you may be asked, for you to recognize is like, okay, your interviewer could be asking you, hey, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Can you tell me how you prioritize your task? Or describe a time when you wish you had done something differently. And we'll also be going about these in details later, but the key here is to give genuine answers. You don't need to be a perfect human. Nobody is. So your interviewer just wants to know whether you'll be a good colleague to work with. And you can also prepare for these, surprisingly. And we'll also be going over the details of that later in today's presentation. And the third kind is program design. So program design questions ask you to implement relatively code-heavy programs to highlight your code proficiency and cleanliness. Just based on reading this description, you may not really understand the difference between program design or like an algorithm questions. But program design question would really ask you to like, code a lot of code in like a limited amount of time, and it may not need to ask you to like kind of demonstrate your knowledge of like advanced algorithms or not, but you'll still like check whether you can code something that could be functional and whether you could like write something in like a neat way. So some example of this is that you could be asked to design a calendar program, which is a pretty common or popular questions for some of these program designs for recent grads. You might be asked, can you write a to-do list app? And then for some of the more complicated one, you may be asked to implement a spell checker or suggester. And then tips here is that you want to ask questions, clarify the requirements, and narrow your scope. And you also want to break down the components as well. So for example, with calendar, you could break down the components into a year, month, date, and event classes, or in like, some helper functions to help generate that and things like that. So this is the program design, and moving on to take-home projects. So take-home project asks you to complete an assignment so that you can check for your correctness, design, and cleanliness. Some of the patterns or formats that we have seen is that you maybe ask like some time-based online assignment that will start a timer once you open up the assignment, and you may have to finish in the next like X number of hours or next like few days. Yeah, with this would then like really like require you to like think through things and try to like implement a working solution. Some other companies are like more hands-off, and they'll give you like an offline assignment and just tell you to come back like in the next week with like a submission of your code. With that, you may have more time and like flexibility to work on it, but just that you also have like other things going on in your life, so you still have to kind of balance how you want to spend time on those assignment versus everything else that's going on in your life. So for these questions or for these type of interview, just do be aware that they do take time. So make sure to do them when you feel most energized and clear brain, and don't have like other commitments going on. For example, you probably don't want to be doing this during the finals or midterm season, because that's really going to get in the way of exam prep. So yeah, just some good advice out there. And moving on to system design. So system design questions ask you to describe approaches or technologies that you will use to design a complex or advanced system or service. This one most often don't really require to write any code, but then will require to like elaborate any kind of like like special like technologies or like services that you'll be using to build a certain system. So the example of this is that you maybe ask, hey, how would you design Twitter, a service that's like really common and popular to like a lot of us here. Or you maybe ask, hey, how would you design Dropbox? Or how would you design an email spam detector? So for this, you also want to think about the components, usage patterns that are required to be supported on systems. And you also want to clarify on other system requirements such as latency, availability, and consistency, because that's also going to affect your choice of like your technologies that you'll be using there. And you also want to think about what are special cases and whether you need to use a different approach or technology. One famous example is that with Twitter, it's you might want to use a different design for kind of like pushing out the tweets out to people, depending on that like author of the tweet was like was one of your friends. That's more like a commoner, versus like a super celebrity like a Beyonce that has like millions of like followers, right? In that case, the design really might need to differ, and you need like a system to kind of combine those hybrid approaches to make this system work across for scale. And and like all this is like really hard and like difficult to learn, but there are also resources out there. There are books such as like Web Scalability for Startup Engineers, data intensive applications that are like really good in helping you learn about these like systems. There's also an online course out there on Educative called Grokking the System Design. That's also really good for interview prep. And other recommendations that a lot of companies and engineers also publicize how they have built some complex systems on their blogs. So it's also good to like, find out about those blogs and just read about how they have built an actual system. And lastly, the 6 kinds of trivia questions. So trivia questions ask you to demonstrate your knowledge of various topics within computer science and software engineering field. Depending on where you are with your computer science education, this may be the hardest to prep for or may not require you to prep at all. So yeah, these are the questions in which you may be asked about the fundamentals of some topics. So for example, maybe asked about what is CAP theorem, which is related to like the database system. From networking, you may be asked like, hey, what happens behind the scene when you visit a URL, right? Because there's like a lot of like domain lookups and like the resolution that has to happen between the time you visit a URL and the server kind of returns you with that page that you're looking at. For some of the programming language question, you maybe ask, well, it's like polymorphism, and you have to like know that, or like if you don't know, then you'll kind of have to try to like learn from the interviewers, because that's also a good time to learn, right? So yeah, so the only tips that we have is try to like learn or review the fundamental concepts from your core CS classes, and you can also learn about them as you read various books and programming languages, so system designs and engineering blogs. So you can also try to pick up knowledge that way. So we went over 6 different types of questions, but for Techquitable, we'll be mostly focusing on the first and the second types, which are the algorithm questions and the behavior questions. And for behavior questions, we'll be having a section on that later today. And for the algorithm question, we'll be kind of covering that for like the next course of 6 weeks or so. All right. Any questions about the different interview question types?
Sorry, I have a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Paula.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering, so for the trivia questions, just because it seems to cover a really broad spectrum of like topics, I was wondering, there was kind of like a bullet point for like reading various books on programming languages or etc. But I guess I don't know like what books those would be, or do you have any more like concrete resources or maybe like a compiled list of questions we should know?
Yeah, this unfortunately don't have like a list for you here today. And as I kind of mentioned, this may be the hardest to prepare for just because like any kind of question may be asked. Personally, I have been asked by my interviewer to like, answer what I know about polymorphism. Having never taken any classes on programming language, this was my first time hearing about that terminology. And then we just, ended up having a conversation, was asking him about that and just learning on the spot. And, so these kind of like situations could happen. And in terms of prepping for it, personally, I think, just trying to like learn about them from, your textbooks or like engineering blogs, maybe the best way to go here. But Jaren, do you have any other recommendations that students could follow?
I was just sort of going to make a point about these disparate interview types just in general. And I think we can take an action to try to see if we can get some more concrete resources for you, Paola, because I think it was a good question. But I think Wintao is absolutely correct that like it could be anything that from something that you've already covered in class, like what does object-oriented programming mean, or something that you probably have seen in a course somewhere, to something that you might not have. And I think sometimes what your interviewer is trying to get at is, if they give you the definition or if they tell you what this thing is, can you apply it to something that you may already know? So it's okay not to have every single thing memorized, but it is sort of kind of teasing out what your experience is. The other thing I kind of wanted to mention, when Tao said that the algorithmic and behavioral questions are what we're going to cover most. And those are things that even experienced engineers need to study for. I think, trivia questions to some extent, take-home projects, and sometimes system design interviews are things that in your coursework you may have already seen or at least have a foundation for. Algorithmic questions are something that even the most experienced engineers may have to kind of brush up on, because it is different from the skills that we're normally doing when just sort of writing software. And so the more that you can expose yourself to different types of questions, the more that you can kind of go over the patterns that you'll see in some of these problems, the easier it will get.
Yeah, thank you for that. And William, seems like you have something to add here.
Yeah, specifically, also going back to something that Jaren said with respect to the trivia questions, like it's okay to not know or to not have experience with something, and to be able to speak to the fact that you haven't experienced it, but then start to work through logically, like call out that you've never experienced it, and then start to work logically through how you might arrive at the answer or where your experiences can connect. But like specifically calling out, that's not something that I know, but let me try to get to the answer, is something that basically like adds to the view of your character and your capability, like from an interviewing technique perspective.
Yep, thank you for that. Those are all great suggestions. Any other questions that you have about interview types?
I have a question.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Sully.
Yeah, so for system design questions, I saw it said like on over there like how you design like the software, how to design like this social media. But yeah, for the questions that are more specific, I think it's more closely related to like the third one, or like how would you design like a type ahead system? I've got that in an interview before. I looked through the grokking book and there wasn't anything specific to that. It was like a more of a microsystems type question. What would you recommend for questions like that? If that made sense.
Sorry, so your question was, you asked a question that was not covered in this other online course called Grokking a System Design. And what was that particular question?
It was like design a type ahead system, and then we're given databases that we could use from, and then yeah, we just had to we had to like design the system. I think we also had to implement it a little bit. Like we didn't have to the code didn't have to be compiled or anything like that, but it was just trying to see. I don't. Yeah, that's my understanding of the question.
I see. Design like a type ahead, or like
Yeah, it's like a recommend, like when you when you're typing something on Google or on Netflix, and like you type in the first few letters,
I see.
and then it's supposed to show you the what you like a list of stuff that you might be typing for.
Yeah, so for those questions, I mean, it's also important to just like recognize, whether you're being asked like an algorithm question and or system design question, right? Because if I'm like an interviewer or if I'm like actually taking this interview and ask that question, I'll first like, ask like, whether they want me to kind of like try to come up with a design that could actually be used in production for like an actual use cases. Or like whether the interviewer wants me to implement a kind of more like a sample or like a demo solution in code, using whatever like in-memory data structure or whatnot. Because then my approach would be drastically different whether whether like which type of question that I'm being asked. If it's a system design and they want me to like really ask that, really answer that, then I would try to like say, hey, these are like the databases that, we could potentially use to understand the different kind of like keywords or like word, that, people could be typing in. And then in terms of like an actual lookup, then I will say, this is algorithms, or this is like the data structure that I'll be using. So I'm not going to get into like an actual solution about those questions, but my recommendation is to first identify, which question type or direction that you're trying to go for along with your interviewer. And to just kind of highlight more on the system design part, besides like reading these like resources, it's also like important to know like things like the different types of database, like especially relational versus like no relational, or some of like the web related technologies such as like CDN and like how that works. Because like those are basically kind of like knowledge blocks that you might want to use over in various system design interviews. So,
thank you.
All right, and then any other questions? If not, we'll move on. And yeah, feel free to also keep the discussion going. Yeah, I see that Dario has added some interesting info there too. So, all right, next topic would be interview process. So let's try to understand how the interview process looks like. So this is the roadmap that should be applicable to most kind of like students going through college years. But we think that there are basically 5 main phases of preparation for an interview. So first is the long-term preparation. So this is like where you are building technical skills and fundamental knowledge through taking CS courses, building project and doing internship. And hopefully this is like something that most of you guys are working on right now. And we think that, hey, this could be taking anyone from like 1 to 4 years, right? 1 is really kind of like the short end of it, which is like, you're really kind of blazing through like all the courses, maybe in like a special format. or like going to a boot camp and like learning all these things in like a very compact like timeline. But for most college students, for like a 4 or 5 year degree, 4 or even 5 is the more kind of like common end of the timeline. So this is like where you're kind of learning the basics. And then moving on to the second phase is like more like a short-term preparation. This is like when you want to like review data structures and algorithms, practice on solving problems using resources such as cracking a coding interview, decode, etc. And then this is also when you also want to practice how you want to answer behavior questions. And timeline for this is a couple of months for most folks, to just like to be able to like do all those things that were mentioned. And then phase 3 is job search. This is like when you want to explore what companies and role you like to work in. And you want to build a list and apply for open positions using company websites, job search tools, referrals, and college career fairs. And this could also take a couple of months. I think, one expectation that needs to be clear is that, when you apply for a job, it is most likely that the company that you just applied for would take anywhere from like few weeks, and even for some companies, even a few months to reply to your application. So, I know that everything, all of, like a lot of the consumer services now are like pretty much on demand, like you call a ride and Uber is going to pick you up next minute. I feel like that kind of instant expectation is kind of built into us now. But for like job application, just please do know that, it could still take anywhere from like a few days, even on the earliest end, to basically like a few months to hear back from them. So also try to build that in your timeline. And also phase 4 is then interviews. This is like, when you want to keep the good communication with the recruiters, because they'll basically act as your river guys to kind of go through the process together. And this is when you want to focus on passing each round by doing what you have been practicing. And you also want to make other options available by continuing to apply to other jobs and following up on that process. And we think that, this process could also take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, but this is just more like a common range. And for some folks, it could take even longer, right? Based on, how long your search is going. And lastly, it's a decision time. So hopefully after you go through all these steps and you have 1 or more offers in your hand, you have to then decide if you'll be happy working in offer roles. And you could try to find out by talking to hiring managers, future teammates, or friends who are working at the company for insight on what it would be like to work there. And if you could envision yourself and see yourself growing and being happy in that role, then most likely you want to take it. Otherwise, if you have some kind of like hesitations, concerns about the roles or even what the company is doing, then you might want to also try to wait around until you have other offers, or try to put more weight in the other offers that you're considering at the moment. For decision, this is usually anywhere from 1 or 2 weeks. But for college students who are just graduating, your company may give you like a longer timeline just because like you're seeing college, like could be anywhere from like 1 or 2 months to decide and to decide on the offer. So yeah, so some special cases do apply there, but usually the offer timeline is about 1 or 2 weeks here. And now let's dive deeper into the specific interview rounds. So what happens when you actually basically after you apply for a role with a resume? So the first round is the resume screen. So when you apply companies with your resume, there is some kind of software and hopefully also a person like looking through your resume. And then, and if it does pass that screen, then you can expect a follow-up from your recruiter and to be passed to the next round. Or unfortunately, if you did not get it, then you just basically receive a standard rejection email. So that's the first round. The second round is like a recruiter call. So if you pass the resume screen, you most likely get set up with a 30-minute phone call with the recruiter. And there'll be conversations about your background, why you applied, and also a chance for you to learn about what the interview process would be from an interviewer. And once that's done, If the company is mostly going for the technical rounds after that, then there will be several rounds of like remote technical rounds. So this will be a 60-minute session with your technical interviewer that will be conducted either over a phone, a video call, as well as on an online code editor or document. And this is like where you could be asked like questions around data structures and algorithms or even system design. And then, you can expect to kind of go through 1 or 2 more technical rounds. And then lastly, you would have like the on-site. Of course, this is like often remote during COVID, but this could be like a 1-day event where you have 3 to 6 interviews like back to back. And one of them would be like a non-technical interview over lunch, that kind of applies now. And then otherwise, there'll be a technical interview session that pretty much follows a similar format as the kind of like the previous round they have been doing. And now going even deeper into what actually happens in that 1-hour phone call. This is like just like a sample interview flow, but for like the first like 5 to 10 minutes, you and the interview would have introductions. And then from like the 5 or 10 minutes mark all the way until like the last 5 minutes mark, this is like the time that you have for problem solving. And here you can be expected to solve anywhere from like 1 to 2 technical questions. I do want to emphasize that you may be asked 2 questions because I have also personally like went through like multiple interviews where there's 1 question and then suddenly the interviewer falls was like a second question to like basically kind of build off on top of the solution that I had for like first questions. So you do want to like kind of move at a pace where you like leave some space to be able to like address the second part that may be asked. But here, like, this is like the bulk majority of the time that you'll be spending on. And lastly, for like the last few minutes that you have, it's usually spent on Q&A. So you have an opportunity to like learn more about the job and also show that you're excited about it, right? With your interviewers. So this is what happens in that 1-hour phone call or over the Zoom. And now to kind of like show you guys behind the screen of like, what goes in during evaluation. We're not saying that this is like the kind of like the golden template that every company uses, but we think that this is kind of like the most popular heuristics that company may use to evaluate a candidate. And we think there are basically 4 themes here. 1 is problem solving, or what's called analytical skills. And this basically asks, whether the candidate was able to need any help solving the problem, and how optimal was the solution, and also how long did it take to arrive at a solution. So this is more like a problem solving. And the second theme is like technical knowledge or coding skills. And basically asks whether the candidate was able to implement a working solution. Was it clean and organized? Did it handle edge cases and so on? So these are kind of like the criteria that are being applied in evaluating along with that theme. And then the third theme is communication and cultural fit. Just to ask, if you were able to communicate well with the interviewer, how did you handle running into blockers? And does your personality or values like fit with the companies and team and so on? So even though this is a coding exercise, it's really important to kind of keep up the communication and sharing the thought process. And we're having a lot of practice of that while going through Techquitable lessons. And then lastly, the 4th theme is experience and ability to learn. This also has like a heavier weight, especially for new grads, just because like new grads don't have much experiences yet. But your interview also try to like gauge whether you're quick at learning and picking things up. So to kind of gauge that, your interviewer may be asked, trying to find out whether you have worked on a large project with team settings, or even in the context of questions that are being asked, do you show signs that you're actually understanding the topics quickly and able to kind of like create a solution based on that learning. So so these are like the 4 kind of like themes that we have seen to be kind of a common across like a lot of companies. when interviewers evaluating candidates.
One other thing I would add on that is, especially for new grads, is how you take feedback. I think it falls under both the communication and the technical skills, because some technical interviews will have like a code review section where you're required or asked for your own feedback about the code that you've written, things that you might clean up if you had more time, giving insight into not just what you wrote, but how you wrote it and how it can be improved. And if your interviewer is providing you feedback or providing you input as you're writing, how you take that. And so I think, a lot of times we talk about culture fit is, how you work with folks, how you fit into the company's values and things like that, but also how you receive feedback as you're given it during the interview process is a big key thing, at least at my company.
Yep, thanks for that additional info. All right, so now you may be wondering, okay, this is a lot, but how can I best prepare for this? And so these are the tips that we have for you. So first, you can prepare a great resume so that you can stand out during your resume screen and start to get those phone calls. And also kind of going over that today. And the second thing that you can do is reviewing data structures and algorithms. And you can use resources such as textbooks and cracking the coding interviews to practice and learn more about them. And the third thing is this is basically in a lot of these interview questions, you're asked about time complexity and space complexity. So that's why you want to know your big O, or basically, what's also known as runtime or space or memory requirements, so that you can analyze your code and also give the right answer to those questions. And the fourth tip that we have is you also want to practice solving problems. So basically, this is when you want to practice a lot of questions so that you also start to see patterns between different problems and become really fluent and quick at addressing them. And then the fifth is that, okay, not only do you have to solve these problems, you also want to be able to communicate and share out the thought process. So you also want to practice on communication, in which you can do by doing it with your friends, or so just practicing the communication part of yourself. Personally, this is what I did when I first started out, is that I felt like I was really bad at structuring my thought. So what I did was in the first few practices, I just wrote down my thought process, because that really made me think about what's my kind of patterns or style of answering those questions. And then I just recited what I wrote, so that I also kind of picked up the habit of it. And after that, after doing a few practices of that, then I got much better at sharing the thought process of communication part. I'm sure different people have different preferences or different kind of strength in communication. So you may also want to try to find out what's going to be your personal way to kind of strengthen your communication style here. And lastly, as I mentioned, do lots of mock interviews. Find your friends. Ask your mentors, or even ask other fellows here to basically set up mock interviews and try to make each other better by going through some of these problems together. All right, so that kind of covers the interview process, and the next topic will be resume, but I'm going to take a pause here to see if there are any questions that out there about the topic that you sent over. Any questions about interview process? All right, if not, we'll keep the train moving and we'll go on into learning about resume. All right, so what is the motivation here? So resume screening evaluates whether a candidate's skills and experience and education is suitable for a role. So writing or having a great resumes can draw the attention of the interviewer and help you get to the next interview round. And we also get asked a lot of common questions from someone who hasn't really written resume before, but some questions include things like, hey, how long do I make my resume? or like, in terms of content, like what do I write in my resume? And in terms of style, like, how do I write my experiences and accomplishment to stand out? And then lastly, how can I organize my resume, right? So there are kind of 4 different like themes here, and we'll try to go into each of those themes. So in terms of length, our recommendation is to keep it 1 page. And this is because, as a junior or less experienced candidate, 1 page is like most likely all you need to know, all you need to kind of show to kind of like concisely tell about your experience to your interviewer. And the kind of like, and also like the fact is recruiters only also spend a very short amount of time to like to read your resume, because they are also kind of like tasked with like going through hundreds and if not thousands of resumes, right? So this is why you want to keep it short and concise, and you also want to just focus on summarizing accomplishments in an easily digestible format. And in terms of content, these are the things that you should include. First, it's a name and contact. 2 is education. 3rd is work experiences. 4th, it's a applicable project. And 5th, it's skills. And to also dive deeper into kind of like the work experience, you want to prioritize on including the roles that are relevant to engineering. So it's okay, if you haven't had like engineering roles or like, any related roles. For example, maybe you spend your freshman summer working in retail. So it's okay if you just write that down. But what would be better is like if you can kind of prioritize on including the roles that are relevant, even if it's like not like a strictly software engineering role. Like for example, you have worked as an IT person within your college library. Then you could also write that down and also try to demonstrate that you have like interest or like some kind of proficiency in a computer related field. And then in terms of projects, you want to write about project that kind of present yourself as more experienced. So you want to include anywhere from like 2 to 4 most significant projects that you have worked on. And that could be projects that you have done in class or like even outside of class. And for this, you also want to state what the project was and like which languages or like frameworks or technologies that you have used. And then for skills, this is where you want to just kind of list them to increase your chance to be seen as a good fit. So there are also kind of 2 things that you could be doing here. So you could list the technical software that you know how to use, such as Linux, Visual Studio, IntelliJ, Xcode. And then you could also include the languages or technologies that you know. So for example, if you know Java is like the most the most familiar language to you, you could write that. And then if the C++ and Python is like less familiar, but you still know how to write them, then you could also list them, but then also put down your familiarity level with them. Otherwise, you could also like put this in a table format if you just like know a lot of different things. And then you can kind of save up on the space and still like list like a great number of things here. All right, and then in terms of styles, you want to write strong bullet points here. You want to focus on your accomplishments, and the style that you want to follow is like you want to show what you did, how you did it, and what the results were. So one example is like, basically you can say I accomplished X by implementing Y, which led to like, the result Z, right? So this is how you kind of like make a strong bullet point about your accomplishment and increase your chance of standing out. Sorry, just to take a pause. I saw a question from Malangus asking, how do we know what proficiency level to write down? Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, personally, I'll say that, I'll probably try to like, not frame it in terms of like what let's see. I'll probably just try to like, evaluate myself on the spectrum or like industry level, right? So if I'm like a college student and I have just learned about Python, there's no way I'm gonna like write Python as like an expert level. At best, like it's probably like intermediate or proficient if I do feel confident about like writing in that language. But but you know, but probably not knowing like all the tricks or different like syntax that you could be that I could be using in that language. So then kind of like, you know, so you kind of have to kind of compare yourself to like, you know, the spectrum of like industry level. And then you also have to kind of be prepared whether you'll be comfortable doing interviews in that language. You know, you don't want to be in a situation where you wrote down that you're proficient in like this certain language and asked to do the interview in that language, but ends up not knowing how to do it at all, right? That's kind of like a worst scenario to be ending up in. So you want to be upfront about that, honest, right? You know, staying probably on the humble side, right? Because you know, people most likely, you know, interview most likely have worked in the field like much longer than you. So yeah, so that would be my tips there. Jern, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, you know, one other thing that I'd add is that I'd be hesitant to put expert without professional working experience in a language. And I think of it sort of as learning, you know, like a natural language as well, is, you know, if you can converse pretty fluently in that language, if you can write code pretty easily using common data structures like arrays and hashes, you're probably pretty proficient in that language. But to say that you're an expert, even in a spoken language, you probably know much more vocabulary. You've been speaking in that language for a lot longer. You know, maybe technical words that maybe the most, you know, common conversational wouldn't come up, but you know, in a more educational or academic setting, that would come up. And so I think it's similar with programming languages as well. Is to be an expert, I think, requires having worked in the language for at least a few years, as well as knowing some of the ins and outs of that language, some of the common gotchas of that language, some of the higher order, I guess, compositions of big applications of that language. And so I hope that helps for folks who have maybe learned a second natural language and to Wen-Tao's point, if you say that you're an expert, or if you say that you are proficient, or you say that you are a beginner, I think that also tempers the expectation for your interviewer. If you say you're an expert in a language, or you say that you are, you know, pretty heavily proficient, they're going to require or expect that you know kind of the ins and outs of that language and are very fluent in writing it. So it's okay to just put that you are proficient and working proficiency in that language.
Yep. I agree 100% with everything you did just say here. So. All right, move on to the next slide. Yeah, so just kind of like elaborating on Styles' point here. So this is like basically different ways in which you could be writing about the same point, but you know, make it better. So an okay way of like saying something is, hey, you know, we built a data exploration tool, you know, resume. Well, that's kind of like boring because like, okay, it just kind of mentions the fact, but it doesn't really like, you know, elaborates, okay, what that accomplished and if there's any kind of outcome that building that like led to. So something, you know, a way to like, you know, write that in a better way would be to say, hey, I addressed company's data discovery issue by building a data exploration tool. Okay, now you kind of like, you know, bring in the context and the reason why you built this tool. And like even the best way to say that is also tied to the outcome. So you can say, I addressed company's data discoverability issue by building a data exploration tool that led to 20% reduction in bug reports related to those data issues. Okay, now you kind of brought in the context / like motivation about why you built this thing and also like the outcome that it led to. So it has kind of like a more complete story about your accomplishment here. All right, now moving on to like organization section of resume. These are very, it's mostly generic tips here, but you know, what you want to have is you want to have a clearly divided section so that it's easy to go between different sections and see where things are located. You also want to have consistent spacing. And then you also want to have it like horizontally aligned. One of like kind of common mistakes that I see from college students is seeing the resume kind of like zigzag because the spacing is not right. So you want to make sure your resume doesn't look like that and kind of like looks like clean and organized, because that also tells that your attention to details is good. And then lastly, you also want to have like a good font family and styles. This is probably not a time to experiment with like a new font. You want to just stick to something that's like really legible and clear to read. And this is also like our resource out there for you. But if you're like writing a resume from scratch, or if you want to like rewrite resume after today, there's an example template that you could that we have it uploaded on Google Drive. So you can make a copy and download them and create a resume based on that. Yep, so that's like one resource that we mentioned. And you're more kind of like interested in trying out other things. Yeah, so Indeed also has a free resume builder that you could be using. I know that LinkedIn also has like a beta version of resume builder. So if you want to try that out, that might be interesting to try it as well. And see a question from Sully asking, is the objectives section recommended? Let's see, I have a mixed feeling about objectives section. If there's like roles like in which like, I clearly know why I'm applying for that company, I might include that. Or even then just kind of like, and now that I have been in the industry for a few years, like I could basically say that, okay, this is like a little bit of my background and to just help the interviewer understand who I am. I might add that, but if you're a college student, you're kind of coming more from like a standard background, that may not add much information to, to everything else that you have to kind of like show in your resume. So I would think that, it's kind of like an optional at that point, but other people may have a different opinion. So yeah, Jern or Will, if you have different thoughts on that, feel free to chime in.
I think I usually leave it off unless, to Wintow's point about the context and the information you're trying to convey. If you feel that there's something that isn't on your resume, but that is useful for your interviewer to know about where you want to go in your career or what you're interested in, I think it's useful to put that objective in. So, if you're coming out of school and you haven't had a chance to learn much about like a particular sub-focus of computer science, but you're interested in it. So if you want to say like, I'm looking for a job in fintech, or I am looking specifically for a job where I can learn more about machine learning or AI, where you don't have that experience in your resume, but you want to convey that is something that the interviewer should consider, I think that objective is useful. But yeah, to Wintow's point, if you're looking for a general software engineer role and that is clear from the rest of your resume, it just sort of takes up space.
All right, thank you. Yep, so any other questions about resume? Not, we'll move on to our last section of today's presentation, which is behavioral questions. Okay, so what's the motivation behind learning about them or being asked about them? So interviewers ask them to get to know your personality, understand your resume more properly, and also to just ease into an interview. So be prepared to answer these questions to give good signals to the interviewer that you'll be a good colleague to work with. So some of the common patterns or like kind of starting line for these questions, behavior question is the following ways. It could be asked like, tell me about a time when blah 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 or something X happened, or like what do you do when XYZ happens, or or like it could be asked like have you ever done something, or like have you ever run into like the trouble with team and how did you resolve that conflict, or give me an example of at the time in which you showed a leadership and led the team to a better outcome, right? So these are kind of like the starting line to some of the behavioral questions. I know that in industry, Amazon is like really big on some of like the the principles that they have. I think they have like 16 different principles or something. I forgot to count. But so they might have like a whole even like sections or interview dedicated for you to like answer those questions, right? So yeah, this is just kind of like a common pattern for those behavior questions. Yeah, so just to kind of also just to raise more concrete example, you could be asked about your time management skills. So, could be asked, tell me about a time when you had to prioritize on different tasks. You could be asked about conflict resolution. So you could be asked, what do you do when you face a conflict with a teammate who's behind in their work? Just let you know, software engineering as a field has a lot of delays in the timeline. So like resolving that or like navigating that is a more like an important skills to have. And then lastly, describe a time when you wish you had done something differently. This kind of like ask whether you can kind of like self-reflect and learn from mistakes or learn from past experiences, which is also big in software engineering. Different companies have like practices such as a retro or postmortem to learn from what could have gone better, or if something like significant or grave did happen, why did it go wrong, and what can we do to prevent that and recover from that going forward. So these are some important kind of skills to have. So this is why interviewer could be asking you a question like that. And the good news is there are also ways in which you could prepare for them. So this is one strategy that you could use, which is that you could, one, pick the right story. So you want to prepare stories that could highlight your soft skills like teamwork, communication, time management, etc. So that you can highlight those traits of yours. And then the second thing that you could do is you can make a statement. You can make a statement. Making a statement basically can lead you to share what you learned from it. And the tips here is that don't make it about whether you're right, but how you grew from it. You don't want to be the person that's like playing that blaming game. It's like, oh, that person was wrong and I was right. Even if you feel that internally, I think the better way to kind of communicate that is like, okay, this is what happened, unfortunately, due to some circumstances, and this is what we did, and this is the kind of how we learned and grew from it, right? Yeah, and then lastly, you want to finish strong, which is like you want to connect the story back to the company or position, and explain how that experience would be beneficial or be useful. Yeah, so this is like kind of like the strategies that you could use, and there are also certain techniques, which is known as STAR method. So STAR method is basically a simple framework that can help you tell us meaningful story about a previous work experience. And STAR basically stands for situation, task, action, and result. And the key idea is that by kind of following this format, you could tell a pretty compelling story. So in terms of situation, this is about setting the scene and giving the necessary details to your example, right? So you want to kind of paint the picture and kind of convey that to your interviewer. And then the task is, describe what your responsibility was in that situation. So what did you have to do in that moment, or what did you have to accomplish? And action is explaining the exact steps in which you took it to address it. And the R, what result stands for, sharing the outcomes that your action have achieved. So just to go through one example here, the question here is, tell me about a time when you had to coordinate a complex task with multiple stakeholders. So let's start with S, which is situation. And this isn't just a sample answer, by the way. So you could say something like, hey, in my previous job, I was working on a project and realized that colleagues from other teams were also working on the same part of the code base, as we were all rushing toward this deadline to launch a feature. So that's the situation. Now you've kind of painted this setting in which it's, there's a high stake on the ground, but there's also an issue, which is that multiple people are working on the same part of the code base, and there has to be some kind of resolution here. So what is the task here? Well, the task here is that I realized that we had to immediately start coordinating and identify which part of the code needs to be reconciled and which parts need to go in what order. This is what you had to do when you have a code conflict with other teams' code, right? And then A, well, the action stands for, the actions, right? So you could say, then I messaged these colleagues as well as my team's managers to set up a group meeting, and in preparation, created a proposal document that lists the steps on how we can go about doing this, right? So now this is the exact action that you took to kind of bring the team together. and start kind of like talk about the resolution that you guys could be taking. And then R stands for results. And here you could say, with the sample answer saying that at the group meeting, people saw my proposal and came to consensus after sharing more feedback. In the end, we executed based on that plan and got to launch the feature just a few days late. So not the most optimal situation, but while that was not ideal, it was certainly better than facing further delays that we would have to face if we didn't flag this issue until later. So here, like, this person is saying this wasn't an ideal outcome, but it's better than the other alternative, which is like only realizing this like much later and not taking any actions until much later, which have caused like even further delays. So yeah, so this is like one way in which you could apply the STAR method to kind of craft a story and tell in a compelling way. So we just went over this technical STAR method, but there's also another technique called story grid. This is mostly like another toolkit that can help you kind of prepare these stories. So basically what this is, it's a matrix, right? And for each row, you basically have like different types of questions that you may be asked. So it could be things like, okay, what were the most challenging things? Or like the things that you have learned, what was the most interesting, etc. Right? You want to kind of cover the most types of questions that you may be asked. And then you want to reduce each story to just a couple of keywords that you write in each cell. So the column kind of represents different kind of scenarios or project you have worked on. So then in that cell, you could write about, okay, for that project, this was the most challenging things, and this is what I have learned. And this is like what was most interesting, and this was most hard about it, and so on. So that you have like this kind of like a cheat sheet that you have prepared to kind of answer any kind of questions that you may be asked during behavioral rounds. And I say cheat sheet just because like, it doesn't really matter whether you get to use this during the actual interview or not. Even kind of going through that exercise in your free time could like, basically make you mentally prepared and know what to say during these behavior question round. All right, so then also to kind of highlight more common questions, you could also be asked things like, hey, what are your weaknesses? Or what's the most challenging part of the project? Or do you have any questions for me? So we'll also kind of go over, how you could be answering some of these common questions. In terms of what are your weaknesses, our recommendation here is that you just want to give a genuine answer here. A genuine answer like really shows you that you have self-awareness and can be capable of making up for it, because we all know no one's perfect, and when we all have some weaknesses that we have to make up for, whether through self actions or with the help of others. So like an okay on kind of boring way to answer this question maybe to say, hey, I work too hard, right? That doesn't really tell you about you or like anything special about you, because when you apply for a job, the expectation is that you do work hard to basically create outcomes for the company that you're working for. So something better is like it's more genuine and more personal. So you could say, I tend to be an optimistic person. While that gives me confidence in taking on challenges, sometimes that can also get in the way of estimating a realistic project timeline. And because of that, I tend to remind myself there's tendency when estimating a timeline, and sometimes ask my colleagues to check my assumption. So this sample answer says that, this is kind of like the characteristic that I have. This is a downside of that characteristics. And this is like what I do to kind of make up for that. And this sample answer, by the way, actually comes from my personal answer. This is actually my flaw. Like I tend to be very optimistic, which makes me pick up a bunch of initiatives and projects, but then also makes me underestimate just how long certain things could take sometimes. And I do recognize that. I still fall into that trap sometimes, but I still try to make up for it with the help of others. So just sharing kind of like this personal anecdote in like sample answer with you guys. And then the second common question here could be, what was the most challenging part of the project? You want to give concrete and detailed answers. Concrete and detailed answers show that you were deeply involved in project and you can reflect on various challenges you faced, right? you don't want to say, hey, I worked on this project. And if you ask like, okay, what's so hard about it? And say, I don't know, because that shows you that, okay, maybe you will not involve like, I'll say you or on the resume. But if you actually like could tell, okay, the ins and outs of the project and including the most difficult part, that's how you could tell, hey, like you really own this project and you really kind of, led to the end of it. So yeah, so you really try to know, right? If there's a project from the past, you may want to like reflect on it and try to remember what happened. So example here is that an okay answer would be to say, hey, I had to learn a lot of new language and technologies. Yes, we understand that is hard, right? But that's also kind of like the common situation that could apply, across like any kind of projects. So you want to get specific and concrete here. So one example answer is to say, the biggest challenge was fixing this bug that kept failing the app to fetch new object from the API. We investigated code several times, but couldn't seem to find the root cause. We started to test various theories, and in the end, the root cause turned out to be the app's caching policy that made the app always use cached data instead of new data from the API. And we just didn't notice it because it was the first time using the new API. In the configuration, this caching policy is not even the official documentation. So you could see like, yeah, this is like a really concrete, like, bug that this person had to face, and just kind of like makes it show, how that person also ended up resolving it. And lastly, this is Kyle's favorite, but what questions do you have for me, right? I think a lot of interviewers like to end that question because they want to kind of pass the ball back to you to drive the conversation and also have an opportunity for you to find out more about the roles. And the quality of questions can also serve as a signal for an interviewer about how interested you are in a job, right? You don't want to be in a situation where like, interviewer gives you that ball and you're like, okay, nope, I don't want to like do anything about it, and say, no, I don't have any questions, right? Because that shows you that, you were not really interested in the role, or you just didn't do any like kind of homework, like learn about the company or the role that you're applying for. So yeah, so that's why you want to have like a good quality questions for them prepared. And here's a tip for you, which is, you could have 3 question categories. The first kind is genuine questions. The second kind is insightful questions, and third is passion questions. And I'm going to also dive into the details of each of those types. But genuine question, basically, the whole purpose is to kind of ask questions to understand more about day-to-day life. So example is like, you could ask your interviewer, how much of your day do you spend coding in? And what does the team composition look like? And what are the good and bad parts of this work, right? Here, you're just asking a question that like makes you genuinely interested in understanding what the day-to-day life is like, once you start working there. And hopefully, most interviewers will be happy to share those details with you and help you also like envision yourself in that role. And then the second type of question category is insightful question. This is basically also asked to demonstrate your deep domain knowledge. So you could kind of like turn it into like a discussion starter. So for example, you could say, I noticed that you use technology X. How do you handle problem Y? How do you guys think about the SLA, which is like the service level agreement? What measures do you have to maintain that level? If you're like a new grad and you ask those questions that are also relevant to the business of the company, that also shows, wow, like you also like thinking ahead, or like thinking of like more of the big picture stuff, and also that also shows you also shows the interviewer that you have like a much deeper domain knowledge about certain things. And then lastly is the passion questions. You can ask this to demonstrate your passion for technology. So you could say, hey, I'm very interested in scalability. Did you come in a background in this, or or were there opportunities in the company that allowed you to learn about it? And if you don't, even if you don't know anything, like you could say, I'm not familiar with technology X, but it sounds like a very interesting solution. Could you tell me about how it works? One kind of example is that if you see a job description that says, we at this company use GraphQL instead of like the REST API, and you're like, huh, like what is GraphQL? right? Then you could, ask that question. It's like, hey, notice on the job description that you guys use this certain technology, but how does that even work, right? And start having that kind of discussion. So yeah, so that actually wraps up our kind of like lesson for today. But lastly, I want to take one final pause here for any questions that you guys had about like behavior questions or anything that were just covered today. So any questions from the crowd? See a question from Sully. How long should responses be for started like behavior questions? Yeah, that's a good question. I think it also depends on the setting. For example, like if you know that this interview round is mostly going to be just about behavioral, then you obviously want to have like perhaps like a little like longer formatted responses, and that could kind of like range anywhere from like few minutes even to like maybe 5 minutes. But otherwise, if it's like what's in the context of like actually trying to also get to your algorithm questions and you ask that question, then maybe it's the best idea to just keep it within like a minute or two, because you still have to like make time to like actually like addressing some of the coding questions that they have later on. So it kind of depends on case by case. So which is why you may want to have like a long version, a bridge version, just so that you can like kind of tell the same story in a different way based on the amount of time that you have. Caster says, I always appreciate when candidates ask about working cross functionality. You can ask about the interviewer's working relationship with product, UX design, and other stakeholders. Teams are sometimes very integrated or very separate. Yeah, Caster, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I think I also appreciate that too when candidates ask, just because like, they try to understand the team dynamics and how also like work across like different organizations within the company. So yeah, just really goes to show that this person is also like, this candidate is like thinking hard about, what it would be like to work there. And just, okay, and got another question. Langu asked, what can I do if I'm asked a question and can't seem to think of an answer? Let's see. Well, maybe I can't think of an answer right now. So, Jaren, do you want to chime in and give an answer?
Yeah, and this is one thing I was going to try to figure out how to fit in, but I think it might apply here. Is I think the best way to avoid getting in the situation where you can't think of an answer or you're sort of frozen is to do your research. So, it starts with the, prepping ahead of time so that you feel more comfortable, that, you've seen some of these things before, that you have questions written out, that you have things that you can reference, especially now in this world of likely remote interviews. You can research this and take notes and have those with you so that you have some grounding as you're being conducted that interview. But if you truly get stuck and you can't think of an answer to a question, that's okay. It is okay to say, let me think about that for a second, or ask clarifying questions about the context of the question itself, or asking more information, and that may trigger something to kind of spark an idea in your mind. And these interviews often are very collaborative. They shouldn't feel hostile. Your interviewer isn't necessarily trying to trip you up or make you look silly. So it's okay to admit that you don't have something right away, or to take a pause to give yourself time to think. But I think the key in that situation is to kind of keep talking, and as you're thinking, to just say, hey, I'm starting to think about X, this is coming up for me, and make it more of a dialogue so that you can, usually those things kind of spark your thought process as well. On the subject of research as well, one thing I wanted to bring up, and Wentao, you hinted at this when we were going through some of the earlier slides, is that often behavioral interviews, often also called culture fit interviews. So if you ever see those terms, it kind of means the same thing, but they are sometimes tied to the company's values, to the company's mission statement, to something about what the company holds dear. And so, on that same topic of research, a lot of those things are prominently on that company's website. Before you are jumping into these interviews, technical or non, you should write out some questions, things that spark your interest, reading their website, reading their blog. And so that also can help you prepare for the types of interview questions that you may see, because they could be tied directly to a core value of that company. And this gives you an opportunity to dive deeper into what their core values are and what it might be like to work at that company.
Yep, that is a great suggestion. Yeah, company website is such a rich resource for you to kind of think about those questions. I mean, I think at the least, like, you want to understand what businesses or what services does that business provide, and you can also try to understand. Then, okay, then what are different like values, right? Some companies are really proud about their values that they have, and even post it on the website. And then you could then also like try to see, hey, what are different engineering challenges that is that company facing? And a lot of companies also proud about that, so they have like an engineering blog dedicated to highlighting some of the achievements of the different teams or individuals within that company that they have made. And you can like learn about the challenges and also see, hey, this is interesting, and maybe I should ask more about that, because perhaps in the future I also want to work something related to like addressing that challenge. And yeah, so that would be also like a good way to like prepare and also understand as well. Right, any other questions? Yeah, with this no other questions, we'll wrap up the lesson here. Thank you everyone for joining us on Sunday for the second lesson of Techquitable. For any of the content that you have like learned about today, feel free to like bring them up with your mentors and try to practice. It will also be a good idea to kind of go through the slides and try to pick up more of the details that are being listed there. But yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to like reach us out on Slack. But otherwise, we'll end the lesson here. So hope you have a nice weekend ahead of you. Thank you, guys.